You're in charge. Um, okay, everybody. So here we go. This is the eighth class. We've got one more after this, and I just want to point out that we're really just sort of doing a framework for what it takes to keep bees, so that you have some sense of all the different things that you might need to think about, and also encourage you to go back and refer to the book from time to time if you need to. So. Um, this class, we're going to talk about summer, fall, and winter hive management. And the cat's doing okay. It's the husband that's a problem tonight. He's making racket. So one of the things that I promised to share was we were talking about marking queens last time, and I was saying that there's different colors for different years. So this is kind of the framework for marking queens. So this year ends in a 1, and so it's going to be white or gray. And if you buy, for the most part, it'll be white. Once in a while you'll see gray, but for the most part you see white because that's the markers that they sell. And then it goes yellow for year 2, red for year 3, green for year 4, and blue for year 5. And then we just wrap around again. Queens typically don't live for more than 5 years anymore. So we really are only marking them for a 5-year span. And the reason to mark queens is there's a couple reasons. For one, it's way easier to find her in the hive. Another thing is to be able to tell how old she is, because when she gets to be a year or a year and a half, you're going to have to start to think about, maybe having a replacement for her, or, depending on how many hives you have, you may want to, have a backup, like, keep a nuke running, so with a good queen in case you need to replace her sometime. Typically when they fail, it's kind of through the winter, and that's the bad news because it's hard to get them really early in the spring. And then the other reason to mark queens is if your hive swarms when you're not around and you're not really sure if it swarmed or not, and you have a new queen and she doesn't have a mark on her, and she had one before, then you know that something happened in the hive. The other thing that'll happen from time to time is a new queen will move in and the bees will let her, and the old queen will get moved out. So sometimes you get a little supersedure stuff going on. So that's all reasons to mark your queens. And you can just buy these marking pens, and they have, they're fairly inexpensive. They're about $3 each, or you can buy 5 at a time. And some people use nail polish or whiteout, but I'm not sure I would recommend that. The whiteout I think probably isn't toxic, but nail polish, I'm not sure. And you're going to be putting the mark on her thorax, which is the part in the middle, and it's the shiny part. And so just putting a little bit of paint on there, so that, and if, over time, the bees will, as they're cleaning her and stuff, it'll start to come off. So, don't be surprised if that happens as well. And then how do you actually get the mark on her? Well, there's a bunch of different ways of being able to hold her in place as you mark her. One of the ones that most people use are these little devices. You kind of herd her into the tube, and then you use the plunger that has a little sponge behind it and get her up. So you can see in the picture on the right, she's up under the screen, and then she's kind of held in place, and you can get to the thorax and you can just mark her that way and just put a little dot on her. In the hive, there's also little kind of push-in things that you can put around the queen to kind of get her in place and then mark her. Or you can actually just even make your own little thing where you push it over top of her and mark her that way. And a lot of beekeepers that have been working with queens and hives for a long time are really pretty good about manhandling queens, and they just pick them up and they mark them. So those are all different things. I wouldn't try the picking up the queen and marker until you've had lots of experience, and also if you have other hives or at least eggs in there, because if you damage her, you're going to have problems. And it's fairly easy to do that. So that's kind of marking queens. Was there a question?
Let's see, there's nothing.
Okay, so can you put her away somewhere? So I'm going to do a little bit of recap over what we talked about last time, because it kind of overlaps a little bit about what we have this time. I'm sorry. This is Lizzie, and she's very bad. Okay, so so we talked about this is the time of year where we're installing packages and nukes. And if you're doing nuke, save the nuke box that it comes in. It'll either be wax cardboard, or it'll be something they call a pro nuke, which is kind of a plastic contraption. So save those because they'll come in handy later. Queens are laying a lot and broods building up really fast. And we're feeding newbies a kind of a light sugar syrup, trying to get them going to help to stimulate more brood rearing and help them with the wax building. Because if you're adding bees to frames that are just foundation, that they need, they don't have any reserves, and so they're really needing to build up. And even if you've got a nuke and they've got some frames with food on it and you're giving them foundation, they're going to need to continue to build. And we're adding frames with foundation now, or we're letting them build from starter strips, or on top bars or something like that. So making sure that they have plenty of food is really good until the nectar flow starts. And we're starting to add equipment in preparation for the nectar flow. So those are some of the things that we're doing. And then back to, we talked before about adding supers. And you really have to be either feeding the bees a lot, a light syrup, or it's right before nectar flow, before you're adding foundation. So later in the summer, you'll see that we don't really, it's harder to get them to draw out good foundation. Even if you're feeding them a lot of times the foundation they draw will be the bigger, like drone comb size cells. And so that's kind of a problem. So this is the time of year to, if you really want to replace a lot of your foundation, this is a really good time of year to do it. So and if you are using a lot of foundation in your supers, you're probably not going to put as many on there. You really want to let them build out most of a super before you add another super. So we're a little more conservative than what we might be if we had supers full of drawn comb, because you could put 2 or 3 supers of drawn comb on once the nectar flow begins, and they'll be fine. And you can kind of induce them to work on the foundation by either making sure that the super that has the foundation is on the bottom of all of your supers, or one of the things that I like to do is I like to pull some of the drawn comb that already has nectar or honey in it, and kind of do a mix between 2 boxes. And that way they see that there's activity in both boxes. And that's one of the ways to keep them working on that stuff. And they really don't like to work on the frames and the foundation in the far ends of the boxes. And so moving those in, as they are drawing out everything else, moving those in is always a really good idea. So we've had, really pretty good nectar flow. The red maples did really, really good, and other things were blooming. And I've seen quite a lot of honey coming in already. Right now, I'm starting to see black locust is starting to blossom, and I love the black locust honey. It's one of my favorites. Blackberries and strawberries are starting to bloom. We're starting to get a little bit of pollen from the tulip poplars, and then the black gum will be coming in. That's in this area. I don't know what's blooming in your area or when, but those are things that you're really going to want to find out. So we're really kind of on the peak. Within probably a week or so, we're going to start to see a real, as long as we don't get rained out. This is the time of year where, you want rain in the evenings or early mornings, but during midday, you really don't want to, because you want the bees to be able to be out there collecting. So I'm pretty excited. It's looking really, really good right now. And we're still seeing some reproductive swarms. I was in my bee yard, I've said before about, you may go out to your bee yard thinking you're going to do something in 15 minutes and the bees will have a different idea. Well, I thought I was just going to be installing a nuke and pulling a few frames to create a nuke for a new queen that I got. And just by sheer luck, serendipity, I happened to, there's a whole row of cedars on next to my bee yard, and I happened to walk around one, and here's a swarm in the tree. And so then I had to figure out how to pull stuff together, and I had nukes available, and then I had to figure out which of my hives swarmed, or was the swarm coming from somewhere else. And so that all went on. That was lots of fun. and kind of exciting. And so, that's one of the things that we're seeing. And since I knew that this one hive, I had split it twice to try to keep it from swarming. But I was still, once they decide they're going to swarm, I pretty much figured out they're going to swarm. And they did, but I was able to get it. And it was low enough that I was able to just, I took my nuke box, I put a couple of drawn comb frames that smelled really good in the box. And then I had a couple of frames with foundation ready to go in with it. And so it was one of the wax cardboards. And the swarm was low enough that I was able to easily hold the box and then just sort of snap. And if you know cedars, they get stuck in the cedar branches and whatever. And so I was able to snap it and get the biggest ball to fall in it, and then put the other frames in, put the lid on it, and let it sit there. And I was able, in doing that, when the big ball came down, the queen was in the middle of that. And then I was able to go back from time to time and shake the branch a little bit. And eventually they all just, once the queen's in the box, they all just walked in the box. And I checked it today and they're doing great. So, and I gave them some little extra food and they're bringing in pollen and whatever. So catching swarms if they're low is easy. The other thing I did with them was since I sprayed them a whole lot with sugar syrup yesterday when I put them in, today I went back and I spritzed them with some oxalic acid. They're, there's no cap brood. So I figure even if if they didn't come from my hive, they could have varroa. And so this is a way to make sure that they're going to be healthy. So that's one of the things I did. You can actually, you can split hives this time of year to make fresh queens or you can catch swarms. And when we catch swarms, we basically treat them like we would a package of bees, except, put them in a nuke or something small, and the queen isn't out. We don't have to worry about, getting the queen cage in right and waiting to see if they accept the queen. They've already accepted the queen. So that's a lot easier. And like I said, have a spare nuke box around. It's really handy this time of year. And also keep a couple of drawn comb around as well, because anything that's real smelly is really attractive. Swarms and packages both like to have smelly, something that smells like home already. Otherwise, they may just think this isn't so great, and they'll take off and they'll abscond. So those are good things to do. And so here's what the nuke boxes look like. The wax cardboard nukes, cost, basically $8 to $10. And the new pro nukes are more like $18 to $20. They're a little sturdier. I actually decided that I like the cardboard ones better because I like the entrance better. You can see the little yellow plug there on there that you just can pull that out. But one of the things I do is I can cover it with like Gorilla Tape or something to make it a smaller entrance to help protect the bees a little bit better. The Pro Nuke, you just pop up the yellow thing on the front. When you pop it forward, it kind of makes like a little teepee kind of thing, but there's no way to really limit, there's no way to do an entrance reducer. So that's kind of a little bit of a concern that I have about that one. So that would be really good if you've got a really big swarm, but just to do a split or something like that, you may want to just stick with the cardboard nuke box. So tonight we're going to talk about summer, fall, and winter management. And summer is big. There's a lot of stuff going on in the summertime that is a little trickier. Anytime we start to have a wind down on a main nectar flow, no matter where you are, it starts to get a little trickier. So that's one of the things, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Honey production is continuing, even if there's not big nectar flow coming in. They had still been bringing in all that nectar that was 50% water, and they've been, kind of putting drops of it all around the hive. And as it dries, they'll be gathering that up and eventually getting it into cells and capping it. So that's kind of going on. And then in the summertime, we think about extracting the honey and taking honey from the bees. And so, that's got a little bit of trickiness to it, because we got to make sure that we leave enough honey for the bees, but we all want a little bit anyway for ourselves. And swarming may still be going on, so we're still paying attention to swarm prep in the hives. The big thing that's hard in the summertime is the nectar growth in the robbing season. So during the hot part of the summer, there's in the Piedmont area of North Carolina in particular, there's really not a lot of stuff growing. And if it's hot and dry, it's hard on the bees. They get real grumpy. And you're more likely to see robbing behavior. And so those are one of the things we're going to talk about too. And then you really have to continue to monitor your hives for pest diseases and queen issues. And during the summer when it's hot and it's dry and there's robbing and there's not enough food, the bees are a lot more fragile. And so that's the time that some of the pests and the diseases will start to really show up. The bees start to get, they're not as robust, and then that makes it easier for different kinds of diseases to take hold, and then when that happens, the pests will come in, the queens could be failing. There's, different things that happen. So we'll talk about that. Were there questions?
How to know when to stop feeding, best place to get extra frames.
Okay, so how to know when to stop feeding? It just kind of depends. When you start to see the bees are bringing in, what you'll notice is there'll be nectar in cells where the queen would like to be laying. So that means you really need to stop feeding. That's one thing. And once you start to see like right now, my nuke, when I first brought my nuke on Saturday, I gave them quite a bit of food, and I gave them a little bit more food today. But then I noticed that the blooms are starting on the black locust. And so that's the last I'm going to feed them. They'll be bringing in from the outside. I would rather have them do that. There'll be enough food coming in over the next few weeks that they won't need anything. So this time of year, it's a little trickier because it's a lot, you want to make sure that they're getting enough food that they're able to build wax, and you'll be able to tell how fast they're building out the foundation. If you're not seeing a lot of activity with them building foundation and there's a lot of bees in there, then you probably ought to be continuing to feed. But if there's a big nectar flow on, I wouldn't worry about feeding them. They'll figure it out. And then when you get into summer and fall and going into winter, we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So, and then what was the other question about frames? You can, so you can buy frames from any of the bee places. And if you want frames with drawn comb and you don't have them yourselves, some of the bee places will sell you a frame of drawn comb. It may be a few years old, and it's usually about $10 a piece. I would reach out to this bee community first, because some of us have comb that we're willing to share for less than $10 a frame. So that's one thing you can do. And there are a lot of, I would make sure if I'm going to get drawn comb, I want it from somebody that I know. So for example, some of the bee supply places, I really know what kind of beekeepers those guys are. I've been in bee meetings with them for a long time. I've been in, I've seen them with bees. So I wouldn't really hesitate very much to take comb from them. But, if you hear like through a bee club that somebody's given away equipment and they've got some drawn comb, I'd be a little hesitant on taking the drawn comb because we just really don't know. So another question?
Well, there was another question that says, so take the food out if we get our nuke on Saturday. Not sure what that means.
Is that Becca?
Probably, yeah.
I'll talk, Becca, I'll talk to you more afterwards about all that. Okay. So, okay. So like I said, transitional times can be hard. So as nectar flow slows down, bees can start to get grumpy, really grumpy. Small hive beetles and varroa are starting to peak. Absconding may occur depending on the genetics. So there are some bees, and there are some bees that we know that where the queens have come from southern Georgia or from the south somewhere, that have probably a little bit of Africanized bees genetics. And the way Africanized bees work is when the nectar flows down, they just move on. And so we've seen some of that when there's a big drop in the nectar flow. you'll see, bees will just up and take off. Um, it's probably, unfortunately, sometimes we don't know ahead of time. If we knew ahead of time, if they're real surly, I would give them a little bit of food and try to keep them in food. Um, so they're less likely to abscond. It's a tricky thing. I mean, this is a balancing act, and it really depends. It takes time, it takes experience, it takes a lot of intuition, and it takes a lot of luck, really, best guessing. So. The queen may be laying less because there's less food coming in. Carniolans in particular will regulate their food by or their laying by how much food is coming in. So they may even just take a break, and you may think you've lost a queen, and in fact it's because there's just not enough food going on. And so sometimes if you feed them a little bit, she'll start laying again. And watch, you can kind of watch the bees coming in the entrance, and you'll see, it's easy to see the bees bringing in the pollen. And if you can kind of judge the bees coming in that don't have pollen on their legs, they're bringing in nectar. And so you can get some idea of how much nectar per pollen's coming in, and you may need to supplement the nectar part, which is sugar syrup. So do you take honey? So we're going into the nectar dearth time of year during the summer. And so the bees will be bringing in some nectar from some plants like clover, because that's going to be the big one in June in particular, or some of the other ornamental plants, but probably not enough to really make honey. And we don't even know, we don't know in June in particular what the fall nectar flow is going to be. In July, late June and July, if it's hot and dry, we're probably not going to get a good nectar flow in the fall. The plants will set their nectaries in June and July. So if it's been really hot and dry, they're not going to really plan on doing a lot of nectar. And so we're probably not going to get a really great nectar flow. So, and your bees are going to need, depending on how big your hives are, 40 to 60 pounds of honey to get them through the winter. And unless you really want to send them into winter with a lot of food that's made from sugar syrup, which isn't going to have a lot of the nutritional value, that might be really hard on your bees. So you really need to think about all that before you take honey from your hives. One thing you can do is you can remove frames of honey. You could put them in the freezer. You could put them someplace cool, protected, and wait until you get a better sense if they're going to need them or not, because you can always extract it later. It really doesn't go bad in the frames as long as it's capped. So that's something else to think about. So timing on removing the honey supers, that's another one that's a little bit on the tricky side, because one of the things that happens as the nectar flow, after the nectar flow stops, you get a few weeks where, they're continuing to move, dry out the nectar and turn it into honey and put it in the cells and cap the cells. Queens are laying less, so now you're starting to see more space in the hive, and the bees will actually start to move the honey around in the hive to make it more efficient for their use. So you may be in and you might see a beautiful super of all capped honey with no brood and no pollen in it, and it's really wonderful. And you go back 2 weeks later, and all of a sudden there's pollen in it, or there's holes in it, or it's uncapped or whatever. Well, they've already started to move it around. So you'll have to be it's a little tricky of when you start to pull those things off. So that's one of the things that just comes with time more than anything, or if you have an experienced beekeeper who could come in and help you out. So what that means, if with all that going on, is if you start to look at frames and you see that some of them are on, they were capped and now they're not capped and there might be brood, you're going to have to go through them frame by frame and, basically pick and choose the ones that you're going to take out if you're going to extract it. You don't really want to be extracting honey that has pollen and brood in it. That it just won't, just don't do that. I mean, it won't hurt you, but it's not going to look good. So anyway, and next week we're going to be talking about products from the hive. So we'll be talking more about extracting honey, pulling frames, how do you get the bees off the frames, how do you uncap it, and how do you extract it, and how do you do the labeling and all those other kinds of things. So we'll talk more about that, but I wanted to at least give you some clue about what's coming. So one of the things that happens during the hot part of the year is you'll see something like this. And so is this a swarm? Are these hot bees? Or is there robbing going on? And so you're going to have to decide what's going on. Um, and this one in particular, I'll just tell you, is hot bees. So we'll talk about each one of these. So swarms generally happen early in the day. So, you know, they'll be hanging out on the front of the hive, getting ready, and they'll be clustering more. They won't be like spread out so much, probably. So they'll be more clustered before they take off and find their next roost before they find their new home. So that's usually earlier in the day. And if you've been in the bees in the last week or you know, 10 days to 2 weeks, you probably saw a little bit of swarm prep going on. So and you know, some swarm cells or something like that. So you know, you should have some sense that this isn't a big surprise. You saw something going on. Hot bees generally beard, we call it bearding when they hang like that. They usually do it late in the day or early evening. If you notice in the summertime, the humidity goes up, you know, later in the evening. And so it's hot. And so they're actually moving out to the front porch, just like, you know, Southerners have done for years, right? Where the breezes are. And by getting all those bees out of the house, it's cooler in the house. And then robbing, you'll see with if robbing's going on, you'll actually see fighting going on. You'll see bees, they'll be louder than normal. There'll be zigzagging going on. We're going to talk about each of those a little bit. So hot bees and bearding. So during the hot part of the year, you really need to make sure your bees have a good water source because they're going to use water for a couple of different things. So one thing is to, you know, do a dish with some marbles or something in it that they can land on and keep water in it. You can do this for all bees. It's all bees need water. So, or you can do like the dog watering thing and just throw some rocks in there so they can get to it. If you have a pond, you'll see them on rocks with their proboscises down drinking. If you have a hose, they may be around the faucet of the hose. If you have a swimming pool or something like that, they may be hanging out there. So, and you know, we'd like to believe that bees really like to have really clean water all the time. The smellier the better, and not close to the hive. They actually tend to go further from the hive, so you don't need to have it really close to the hive. They'll use the water to help cool in the hive, and they also use it to thin the honey as they're using the honey and making food. Um, and so what they do is they kind of put droplets around the hive, and then they fan the bees inside will be fanning their wings, and so it's a way of cooling the hive. And then also bees on the outside will be fanning their wings to try to get airflow coming through. The bees will leave and go on the front porch so that there's not a lot of body heat and there's more room in there. And so that's one of the things that they do to help out. And it's like I said, they'll be hanging out most common later in the day. Um, so other things that we can do is screen bottom boards um, and cracked outer covers can help with airflow. So if you've got a screen bottom board, you got more air coming in. And you see, this is an inner cover on one of my hives, and that's just a piece of a paint stick that I stuck up there. So you really want it to be smaller than about 3/8 of an inch, quarter inch, less than around a quarter inch or a little bit less, because you want it to raise up the outer cover. The outer cover goes over top of that. So it just gives it a little bit more airflow. So air coming from the bottom and from the front, then you get this, you know, kind of moving through the hive. You don't want to leave enough space that bees can get in because that'll encourage robbing and other kinds of problems. So that's another thing you can do is make sure that there's a little bit of airflow in there. Nectar dearth and robbing. When there's not a lot of food coming in, bees become very opportunistic. And so if it's a small hive and vulnerable, or even if it's a big hive and maybe not very healthy, other bees will come and just take the honey. So that's one of the things that happens. So once the big nectar flow slows, one of the things you should consider doing is, if you don't already have an entrance reducer in, put an entrance reducer in and make it a smaller entrance so it's easier for them to cover, to guard that entrance. Or you might just add robbing screens. So there's lots of different kinds of entrance reducers. Here's, you know, the standard cleat that comes where it has two sizes. And, you know, this works fine, especially if, you know, people worry about airflow a lot, but if you have a screen bottom board, um, and you crack the top, that works. Or even if you even have a small space in the front and can crack the top, they'll work it out. They'll be fine. But there's other kinds too that have, like this one down in on the right in the middle. It's got a lot. It's got a lot of more airflow, but it also protects, and you can kind of figure out how much space you give them. So that's kind of a nice one. And then the one below, you can decide how much space it has as well. And then this is a robbing screen, and I keep a robbing screen. I used to keep them on all my hives, and then I sold a bunch of my hives and sold the robbing screen. So now I'm starting to replace them. But you notice the thing about the robbing screen is it's got a lot more screen space, so there's lots of good airflow. And on the bottom, you see the little things that you can raise up, and it gives the bees sort of a way to come and go during nectar flow. So it's a big entrance. Or during robbing season, you close those and you open the one on the top, and the bees will figure out how to come and go that way, but the robbers won't figure it out. And so it's a way to keep them from robbing. And so that works out really, really well. The other thing that you can do is don't use external feeders during a nectar drift, because that'll attract robbing. If you're in your hives, try to get in and out quickly, because if it's open, that'll attract robbers. The other thing I do is I smoke all of my hives before I get into them, so that they're all a little on the defensive side. And that way they're less likely to be bothering about what the one I'm in is doing. So that's another thing. And then if you're going to feed internally, and I usually do it later in the evening, like 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, late afternoon, evening. They're real grumpy if you do it once the sun has started to set, because they're in crawling mode instead of flying mode, and they tend to be really loud and noisy and a little bit aggressive. But if you feed them at night, they're able to eat a lot of what you give them, and then come daytime, it's less likely that it's going to attract robber bees. And so what does robbing look like? So it'll be a lot of bees approaching the hive and leaving the hive. So just think of it as, coming and going. They're coming and stealing and going away. And none of the ones coming will have pollen on them. And during the summer months, you should still see pollen coming in, because there's a lot of pollen. And they'll also be kind of zigzagging back and forth, because they're trying to figure out the best way to get in. So they'll be checking for cracks or other entrances into the hive, and there'll be fighting going on. You'll actually see fighting going on, and there may even be dead bees on the landing board or in front of the hive. So this is kind of what robbing looks like. You'll see that they're kind of spread out a lot more. Some bees may look black and shiny, and that's because they're starting to lose the hair that's on them, so they're becoming shiny. And it may be louder than normal. So you'll see all of that. And you also see down below, there's grass down there. That's the entrance, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. So one of the ways you can stop it or slow it down is you can stuff grass in the entrance, so it closes off the entrance. And you don't have to be there, because what will happen is, over time, as things slow down, the bees inside will just push that out. They'll get the grass out of there, and they'll be able to come and go. You can also kind of wrap the whole thing in a wet cloth, and so that's a good thing. And then one of the things, and since Vicks Vapor Rub was invented in Greensboro, this is actually one of the known things throughout the world, I think, is if you take Vicks Vapor Rub and rub it around the entrance, the smell will distract robber bees, but the bees that live there can still come and go. They still know that's their hive. And I've actually done that, and that's really helped out. So that's another thing you might want to do. If you look in my bee bag, you see all kinds of weird things. And what happens if you're not there, but you go and you go, what happened to my hive? Well, if there are a lot of dead bees on the ground and on the landing board, that's a sign. And there may be very few or no bees left in the hive. And the real clear key is, when you look at the honey frames, they're going to be stripped clean, and there's going to be lots of fragments of wax and ragged wax pieces. So they kind of just, come in, and they're not being careful, and they're not whatever. They're just going in and ripping the wax out and taking the honey and going. And robber bees can decimate a hive in about 2 hours. It's just a really awful thing to watch. So, and it's not an uncommon thing. So that's one of the things. And they're just like a train. They're coming in and they're going out and they're taking it and they're fighting and they're, it's just not pretty, but that's one of the things that happens. We're going to be monitoring for other problems. So, sugar shakes to monitor for mite load. We'll be doing that. Treat as needed, but make sure you're timely in when you do your treatment. So if you do a sugar shake and you find that you need to treat, you really need to do it within the next couple of days. If you wait over a week or 10 days or whatever, it may be the difference between saving the hive or losing the hive. And I actually saw 2 strong hives die because the person who knew that they had a fairly high varroa count really sort of struggled with what she was going to do and how she was going to do it and whatever. And by the time she got around to it, it was just too late, and she lost both of them. So that's one of the things. So timeliness when it comes to monitoring mites and treating for mites is really, really important. Sugar shake again after you treat to make sure that the load is back into a safe range, because it's not uncommon that you treat and then there's still enough and you may need to do another treatment. So that's one of the things. And you also want to make sure you select a treatment that's appropriate for that time of year. So if it's really hot, there are certain things you're not going to be able to use because it'll be too um, hard on the bees. Things like thymol will be, it'll be too much smell in the air and that'll be really hard on the bees, or the formic acid, that's really hard on the bees. So, make sure that you know about things that you can use at different times of the year and different temperatures of the year. Another pest control thing that we're still paying attention to is the small hive beetles. So you can do in-hive traps. These are just beetle blasters. They cost $1, $1.50, and you put oil in them. A little bit of oil, not full, and then the bees will drive them into the. They'll be chasing them around, and so then the beetle will go in there to hide, and they'll get stuck in the oil. The other thing is you can do these traps that go under. If you have a screen bottom board, they actually will slide under, and they have a pan that you put oil in, or there's other kinds of things you can put in there, and the bees or the hive beetles will go in there to hide, and then they won't be able to come out and they'll die. So those are different things you can do. There's a lot of different traps. I know a couple people who are using the trays with the oil in it that go underneath, and they like them. They think that works pretty well. If you have a solid bottom board, you can't really use those. I don't know if there's anything that goes in a solid bottom board, but there's a lot of different kinds of in-hive beetle traps. So you can just find one of those and see if that works for you. Moth for wax moths, there's wax moth traps that you can make just with a liter pop bottle, and you make a hole in it, and then you mix together, like a cup of sugar, a cup of hot water, a cup of cider vinegar, and a banana peel, and you put it in there, and then you like hang it in a tree, and it'll attract wax moths, and they'll get stuck in there and won't get out. You also attract yellow jackets, other kinds of moths, maybe a couple of other kinds of bees, but it's really pretty effective. And then when it's full, you can either clean it out or you can just throw it away and start a new one. And in the handout I did last week, the basic beekeeping techniques from Dr. Buddy on page, I think 10, he had a thing about external beetle and wax moth traps where he talked about how to do it as well. So you can do that, and that's kind of helpful. For ant control, if you have a stand that has legs, you can put it in a pan with water or oil, and that'll help keep ants out. Ants are more a nuisance than they are a real problem for the bees. What I do is I use cinnamon around the edge of the top of the inner cover for the small ants, and if they're big ants, and I don't really get big ants, but you can use grits for those, and they'll basically take that and take it back to the hive and eat it, or take it back to their, I guess it's a hive, mound, hill, whatever. Yeah. And yeah, colony, and eat it, and they can't digest it, and so it just kills them. But anyway, it works really good. And if you're doing sugar shakes and you have cinnamon, then you got cinnamon sugar bees, and that's really cool. That's a joke. Don't try that, really. The other thing for monitoring for problems, remove equipment if necessary. If bees have too much space that they can't patrol easily, then you'll probably get a wax moth problem. Almost all hives have some level of wax moths in them, but the bees usually can handle it pretty well and keep it under control, so you don't really need to worry about it. But if you start to get, more space than you have bees to guard it, then you really will get a wax moth problem, and it can, within a couple weeks, it can take out a hive. So you really want to make sure that you're keeping appropriate equipment on your hive. And during the summer is not the best time to add foundation unless you're really feeding them a lot, and you really need to feed them like really light sugar syrup, which will help them build foundation. But I haven't had very good luck getting them to build um, foundation unless it's on like pre-printed foundation. So like if you used crimped wire, they'll build regular size cells. You can take real thin, there's a real thin plastic that you can then coat with wax and they'll build small. But if you just letting them build from scratch, they're going to build bigger cells. So it'll be drone size cells. And then that's a problem for later. And pay attention during this time for the brood patterns, because you might start to see brood problems coming up. You may have a queen that's starting to fail. You may have, even though you aren't really seeing a big varroa problem, you may be seeing diseases vectored by the varroa. You may also, if it's been rainy and a nectar dearth, you may have a little bit of European foul brood. That's a stressor disease. So there are different things. So pay attention to the brood patterns. Requeen if necessary, if your queen is starting to get old. There's a better chance of actually being able to find a queen this time of year. And if you have a new queen that you're doing late summer, early fall, the hive will have a better chance of making it through winter and spring in the next year. And remember that how quickly a colony can recover to whatever problems are going on depends on how soon you can get in and address it. So, I tell people try to be in your hives in some way every 10 days to 2 weeks. And during the nectar flow, it's really monitoring how many, how many supers they have and do they need more space, those kinds of things. And the rest of the year, I'm doing quick brood checks and, health of the queen, are we laying, what's it looking like, all those other kinds of things. Fall management is, later in September, October, and early November. Brood rearing goes up again in the fall because we're trying, they're getting ready for winter. So the summer bees, last for six weeks basically. So they got 3 weeks in the hive and 3 weeks as foragers, and they're flying a lot, so they're wearing out, and so they don't last real long. But the winter bees are a little bit hardier. Their hair is longer, so they'll look hairier. They're really very cute when you look at them up close. And they'll have a little bit more fat body to get them through the winter, so that instead of lasting for just 6 weeks, they can last for 4 or 5 months. So they'll be being fed differently when you get into the fall. Drones will start being removed. I always say that, football season, that's when they're out. So you'll actually see worker bees hauling them out and throwing them off the front porch. Because they can't afford to feed them. All they do in the wintertime is eat, and they can't really afford to feed them in the wintertime. So they're going to get them out of there. And the queens will stop producing drones. It's really kind of a really nice time of year because it's a lot easier to find the queen when there aren't a lot of drones in there. And the other thing you'll do in the later part of September and maybe very early October is you'll start to actually move things around. You're going to be removing equipment. You're going to be, if you've got frames of honey stored that you can bring back and add on, you'll be doing that. You'll be moving brood down as far as you can get it into the bottom boxes, because you really want them to start down, put some honey down there around them so that they have food to eat down there, because through the winter, they're going to just move up. They're never going to move down. So you really want them to be able to start down and then move their way up. And so if you put honey above them, the queen won't be up there laying. She'll stay down there. And then as they eat the food down there and start to move up, they'll move up as a cluster. The one thing I didn't put in here and I really needed to put in here is if you're using queen excluders, this is the time to get them out of there, because if the brood moves up and there's a queen excluder, the queen is left behind and then you've lost your queen. So make sure you do that. It's really important to have a good queen going into winter, because you're probably not going to be able, we're just now getting queens. So, that's a long time to go. No hive is going to be able to survive. You'll be, merging them in with other hives that are queen right. So you really want a strong hive going into winter. And you really want to consider combining hives. If you have one that's just kind of limping along, it's not going to make it through winter. In the bottom, I say be brutal. You really have to, because it's not going to make it. And having those bees be part of another hive that is like medium to pretty good, it'll give them a little extra boost. The food can go with them, so you can do that. Or you could actually, if you've got them in a 10 frame and they're kind of limping, but you could put them in a 5 frame medium, or if they're in an 8, I've moved them into 5 frame nuke boxes and they've done fine. So they really need to have space appropriate for whatever size they are. So if you're going to combine hives, the newspaper method is what I really like best. So first you need to determine which of the hives you're going to keep the queen. So you probably have one queen that's better than others, and you're going to kill the one that you don't like, unless it's queenless already, then you don't have to kill her. So you're going to have to find her, and then you're going to pinch her head off basically, or squash her, or do something like that, but make it fast. So the thing that you'll do is, so you have a hive and it's got, this is where you want this combined hive to be. So you pick the two that has the location where you want to keep them. And so you take the inner cover off of that hive, and you take the you take the outer cover off that hive, and then you take the inner cover off of that hive. And then you're going to put a sheet or two of newspaper over top to cover the whole thing. And some people will use 2 sheets. I typically just do 1. If they use 2 sheets, they may put a couple of little slits in it to help the bees, chew through it, or they may spray it with sugar wire or something like that. I do 1, and then I just leave it and they do fine. So this is kind of what it looks like. You can see this one is just a sheet of newspaper on top. And then the other one it was after there were frames or boxes put on top of it, but they also had some slits in it. And then what you do is you just then place the hive bodies from the other hive where that you're merging. You just take the hive bodies and you put them back on top. So, and you put them in the reverse order. So you make sure that, it's the brood chamber, and then, however many brood chambers, and then, any supers, and then, and you leave the old bottom board and the old inner cover and the old outer cover behind. And then you place the inner cover and the outer cover from the base hive back on top of it. And then a few days later, what happens is they can smell the other bees. And so they kind of get used to them. Because if you merge 2 hives, the new hive doesn't know that queen and they're going to kill that queen. You don't want to do that. But you want them to get used to each other's smell. And by the time they chew through the newspaper, they're kind of used to each other's smell, and they're all one hive again. And then after you do that, then you can go through and you can finish your winterizing. So now they're used to each other. You can get back in it. You can move all the brood to the bottom and then put the supers above it, and they'll be fine. And that's really a good way to get them through the winter. You want to do a mite check again in the fall and treat if necessary. This is kind of the last chance. There's something you can do kind of in winter, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And you want to continue to deal with your small hive beetles and your wax moths, because you really want them to be pretty healthy going in. You really want to pay attention to how much food they have on them. So you want to have, depending on what size hive you have, you want the equivalent of about 2 supers per hive. So if you've got an 8 frame, then it's 2 supers, 16 frames. If it's a deep or if it's a 10 frame, it's, 20, and maybe a couple of in the brood area as well. And that's ideal. And if you don't have that, it's not that the bees won't make it through winter, it's just that you're going to be feeding them a lot more. And so if you don't have that going in, feed them, feed them, feed them, feed them. Start with 1-to-1 syrup, and as it starts to get a little cooler in the 60s and 70s, go to a little thicker, so 2 parts sugar to 1 part, and continue to do that. Once the temperatures get around 55 during the day, they're going to have a whole lot harder time dealing with being able to evaporate the water from it and be able to use it. So then you're going to have to do something else like fondant or something like that. And make sure your bees have good ventilation going into winter. So again, entrance and, keep them cracked a little bit. Entrances down to the smallest size because they need to really be able to protect themselves. Make sure there's a windbreak on the northern side of some kind of protection on the north side to keep them protected. And you can either do that, if there's a tree line there, that's really good. You could put hay bales, or you can build some kind of a thing, a fence or something. So, and if you have a screen bottom board, you don't, and your bees are on a raised hive, you don't necessarily have to close the screen bottom board, but you should consider wrapping the hive stand. The screen bottom board's not really a problem. The problem comes in when wind is coming under the stand, and it'll actually pull the warm air out. So if you wrap the stand, you kind of can create sort of a microclimate down there, and that works out pretty well. The other thing is all the screen bottom boards pretty much have little things that you can slide in, for sticky boards or whatever. And so you can do that. And I always, if I'm going to do that, I leave a little bit of it open, just because I like to have, they really need airflow through the winter. But this is what my hive stands look like when I wrap. And I just use house wrap from Lowe's. It's cheap. I just wrap it around and tape it and staple it. And so there's no way wind is blowing under there and pulling the warm air out. Winter management. This one's fairly straightforward because there's not a lot going on. So you're not in the hive. So you're not in there. You're not doing big inspections or anything. You're checking hive weights all the time. You might add fondant or sugar candy, or they actually sell things called winter patties. Or at Christmas time, I usually give my bees a pollen patty because when she starts laying mid January, they're going to need pollen. And so you put those on the top. And I typically, what I do is in the winter time, if it's warm enough, I'll just sort of quickly, on a sunny day and not windy, I'll quickly look. And if I can tell by the fondant, if the fondant is starting to get sticky and tacky, it means there's too much moisture in the hive. And so then I got to do something about that. If they're eating a lot of it, it means they've already eaten through their honey stores. And so I'll need to add more food to it. So it's kind of a way for me to really quick, in a minute, tell what's going on in there and be able to either add more food or do something to help them out. The other thing that I don't have on here that in terms of mite control, in December or late November, when it's about 40 degrees, okay, so we have no brood anymore. The queens will stop laying sometime in October. The old beekeepers always said that once the temperatures get to 55 degrees, the queen will stop laying about 6 weeks later. And so it's 4 to 6 weeks later. So that's kind of a gauge. But once she's, she's not laying anymore, so you have no brood. So that's a really good time to do an oxalic acid drizzle. And if you do it when it's about 40 or 45 degrees, you're just drizzling between the bars. And, with the oxalic acid, it comes with instructions of how to mix it and how to do the drizzle and how much and all that other stuff, depending on how many bees you have. There's no brood, so there's no varroa hiding anywhere. So any varroa that are there are going to be killed off by the oxalic acid. And the first time I did this, I thought for sure I was going to be killing my bees. And they came through beautifully. They just thrived. It was so good. So, this is one of those things that we kind of do on faith. So that's one thing to consider. So I always do that in like November, December on a day when it's like a 40, 45. Because they'll be, if it's that cold, they're clustered, but it's not freezing. And so they'll be able to deal with it just fine. Through the winter, we're also cleaning up and preparing all our equipment for spring, ordering new equipment, planning on what we're going to need in terms of nukes and packages and queens, because when they start, usually in January, those things are starting to be offered. And so that's one of the things that you really want to be prepared for, to get your orders in early, especially with packages, because the earlier that you can order, a lot of times you can get one of the early spring deliveries as opposed to one of the later ones. There's still ones that are coming in May. So, and then catch up on your readings, go to meetings, go through your notes, figure out what worked, what didn't work, what do you want to do in the coming year. That's the time where we really start to think about, along with the seed catalogs, figuring out what we're going to be doing come spring, right? So that's a good thing to do. Next week's we're going to be talking about products from the hive. So we'll talk a lot about honey producing and labeling. We'll talk about wax and how, what you can do with wax. And there's a lot of different things. We can talk about propolis, pollen, and apitherapy, and maybe a few other things. So that's everything for this week. And it's 7 o'clock, but there's some questions.